right, good evening, guys. Since we're not having class this evening, I figured I'd make a brief recording, kind of going over the slides and what we're going to be talking about this week, um, instead of recording the full prep class lesson. I think the outlines should be pretty self-explanatory. However, uh, if not, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about those. But so this week we'll be taking a look at the second part of, I guess, Christ's rookie year, as Luke records it in chapter 5, verses 1 through 26. And again, we're finally reaching the point where we're going to start slowing down on how many verses we try and get through each week. So the outlines will be a little bit more oriented to class participation as well. So this week's great is Brock Purdy. Not necessarily because he's won any awards or he has done any statistical greatness in his rookie year, which just ended last Sunday, but rather he's done something for someone who's been drafted where he was that had never been done before. See, Brock Purdy from Iowa State had been drafted last in the NFL draft. And usually if you were drafted last, you didn't really see the field a whole lot. However, with the 49ers having so many injuries, he became very quickly a starter this year. No one who had been drafted that late in the NFL draft had ever completed a forward pass. So that was a big deal. And for his career. However, he also went on to set other notable marks for a rookie, as he went nearly undefeated in every game he started, and he only lost in the NFC Championship game to the Philadelphia Eagles, like I mentioned, this past Sunday. He's not one of those individuals that looks exceptionally athletic, but his athleticism is deceiving. That, and with the team the 49ers built this year, he didn't really have to be the greatest player at all times, but he still was doing some pretty tremendous things for a rookie. And his rookie year is somewhat similar to how some may be inclined to view Jesus's rookie year, because he's doing exceptional things for someone from such unexceptional areas. And so this week we're opening up with, there's basically three stories we're going to be emphasizing. One is Jesus travels from Capernaum to Gennesaret, where he calls Peter, James, and John. And so I included a map here so you can kind of get a feeling for where he is and around the Sea of Galilee. I know many English translations record it as the Lake of Gennesaret. However, that is a Roman name, and it was not always used by Hebrew writers or even Jews of the time. So again, it's just another one of those small details that reminds us that, oh yeah, Luke is writing to a a Roman audience. And so we see he moved a little bit down the road, and he's moved closer to the at-large, I guess that's the western side of the sea, but he's still pretty far north on the Sea of Galilee. So that's where he is. And they he's there as Peter, James, and John are coming back in on the boats. he has a crowd following him. As we saw, crowds were already following him from after he left Capernaum. It's likely people started to hear words and notice he was traveling and started to follow him in Gennesaret. So Jesus goes to address the crowd. He goes upon the boat and preaches, which I'm sure Peter and James and John weren't angry about, but it was probably one of those frustrating moments where, great, we're trying to go home for the day, and yet now we have to wait until Jesus is done. And they hadn't been called, so they probably were a little confused even at who Jesus really was. But there's a lot of things in the handout that we're going to that I try to emphasize how the call of discipleship is portrayed in these stories. So you can read those bits. I'm not going to recite that outline at this time. But we see they're called. But something interesting about this call is something so great is done by the will of God in comparison to human will. Because Peter, James, and John were out on the sea all night, and they were willing and they were desperate for any fish to come into their nets. But from how it's recorded and how the story is told, it seems as if they're bringing back no fish at all. And yet they're on the shoreline. They're not in the depths of the sea like they were all night trying to catch fish, but it's there where God wills for fish to fill their nets, and so much so that it starts to break the nets and sink their boats, which means it's a lot of fish in a very small area. But again, it's contrasting that with my version described it as Peter tells Jesus, "What good is this? For we have toiled, or we have done tremendous amounts of work all night trying to catch fish," showing how diligently they were working on catching fish, whereas Jesus kind of just waves his hands, and then their nets are filled. And so it's showing us kind of God's will works a whole lot different than human will does. And then there's implications of parts about discipleship in that as well. Another bit that shows up a lot in these first two stories, and even kind of in our third story today, is the idea of being unworthy. Peter throws himself at the feet of Christ and says, "Get away from me, for I am sinful." And it's we hear a lot of that even in our modern churches today, and so it's up to you guys on when you want to or how you want to kind of address that idea. But I included in kind of what I was going to do was bring up this idea of kind of comparing our sins to mountains and the depths of God's love to the ocean, because there's I'm not trying to confuse analogies, because Jesus will later say, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can tell a mountain to stand up and throw itself into the sea. I'm not necessarily trying to echo that language, but what I'm trying to say is our sins to us, when we're standing next to them, are like mountains. They're not all of them are the same shape. They're not all the same sizes. Some seem a whole lot bigger and more gruesome and grueling to deal with. That doesn't mean really that much when you start to think about, if we're trying to throw it into the sea, the deepest part of the sea is about 36,000 feet below sea level, and only the highest mountain on the planet is only 29,000 feet above sea level, which means I'm going to switch from feet to miles. There's about a mile and a third worth of water from the peak of the mountain, if we're setting it at the lowest point, to the top of the sea. So it's that idea of no matter how great we think something is, it is nothing compared to the greatness of God's love and compassion for us, and especially our sins. Our sins are nothing to us. And I've heard some people have tried to push back about illustrations like that. Well, because water displacement and all of that, and what if you added more mountains or whatever? That's not the point, though. The point is God's love, compassion would be able to cover, surround, embrace, no, whatever it is, no matter what size it is. Um, just like putting a mountain in the sea. And so that's kind of what I was going to include in my lesson. You guys can add or change or adapt that however you'd like. The next story we get is Jesus cleanses the leper. What we see here is, again, that idea of not being worthy enough. With lepers, especially in the culture that they're in, being touched was already pretty much out of the picture. And so, unlike some of the other uh, individuals we see in the Gospels, who, uh, for example, the woman who's been bleeding for, I believe, 40 years and hasn't found relief, she's seeking uh, healing from Jesus, and the whole story revolves around touching. Whereas this leper feels as if he's unworthy because of his leprosy to even be touched, um, because he's been ridiculed by the community, uh, and being deemed unworthy of being touched. And part of that is being cared for. So he's focusing on Christ. If you will just say, I will be healed, that is all I need. And so, but what we see here is Christ does so much more than that. Christ goes and he touches and embraces, most likely, this individual who hasn't been touched since he's had leprosy. Um, he hasn't been able to touch certain things, and he's definitely hasn't had anyone come and touch him, um, even to pat him on the back or give him a handshake. So this is a significant moment for him, just being deemed worthy of being touched by the Messiah. Um, Another interesting note, you may want to include it, you may not. Um, Luke again has this weird medical language. I know I pointed it out with my class, and I don't think I brought it up last week, but Luke's, for being considered traditionally a doctor or someone who is trained to be a doctor, he has some very odd medical language. Last week we saw it with Peter's mother-in-law's fever. It was described as kind of similar to the affliction of the demon-possessed man, just the section before, where it had to be cast out and rebuked, instead of a more medical phrasing of the fever. And now here, instead of saying he was covered with leprosy, or he was with leprosy, as some might say it, uh, it's described as he was full of leprosy, which again shows kind of a weird uh, medical phrasing. That there's several possibilities. Maybe it's the Romans just had a different way of seeing medicine, um, or kind of what I've started to think was what he was trying to bring out was, we know the Jews have a this idea of this sin is what causes physical ailments or sicknesses, or someone to be paralyzed or blind. Um, so it could be one of those things again where he has been filled with sin, um, and that's why he is leprous. Because it wouldn't be unforeign for even Gentiles to have a similar belief, but it is still odd for someone we traditionally to say as a doctor to be referring to sicknesses like that. And then we get to our final section. What we see here, and I included this. There's a few notes. Again, there's evidence from Luke's gospel that this is written to Gentiles, or a more Romanized society. Just in the phrasing of they removed the tiles of the roof. Well, Israelites and Jewish people would not have built their houses with tiles like the Romans. They would have built straw, hatched or uh, thatched roofing, just so it would allow the house to stay cooler, and it could be used for drying out resources without making them dirty again, based on their cleanliness standards. One thing, though, to remember, um, and I think I included most of this, um, but I don't think I went as in depth as I should have. The three types of people: the Pharisees, the friends, and the paralyzed man, um, who are coming to Jesus. They all are different. The Pharisees are the types of individuals who think that they have all the answers and that there's rules that have to be kept. The friends are those who are so concerned for one friend that they are willing to do whatever it takes to support them, and to get them to that point of forgiveness. And then you have the paralytic man who's been overcome with evil or sin, and who has to rely on his friends to be brought forth. I included a question. I think it was along the lines of, to which of these three groups that came before Christ do you relate to most? And I think that description is probably one that I left out. Um, but that's it. And then we have kind of a more vision focused application question or closing question for them to think about throughout their week. All three of these stories exemplify discipleship and service and dedication to God. How can we take the same attitudes, the same approaches, and even the same mindsets as we seek to serve God as disciples? As Dale mentioned last Sunday, we are always trying to continually make disciples that know God, love God, and glorify God. But we also need to be disciples ourselves that know God, love God, and glorify God. I know that wasn't all the notes. I know there's probably a lot more questions than answers, but feel free to reach out to me, and I'll hopefully be able to answer your questions. But that is this week's lesson. Go and make it your own. And I'll see you Sunday.